Last week was busy. There were 2 trips to Waco to pick up food for distribution. There was a wonderful visit from the Caswell clan. There were 2 physical therapy sessions. There was food distribution. This week, at least so far, will be less hectic. 2 physical therapy sessions occupy the schedule. Next week will be extremely busy. There will be 2 doctor's appointments in Temple, 2 physical therapy sessions, 1 or 2 food pickups in Waco, and food distribution. I'm not complaining. I'm thankful that Debbie and I are healthy enough to be busy. When I think of Jesus, my Savior, I see a very busy man. The 4 Gospels describe a busy man. He was always teaching, healing, working. He did take time to rest. He took time to pray. He took time to socialize, to be with people. He enjoyed being with people. But he had an extremely full schedule. The Gospel writers especially describe how full his last week was, that last week before his death. In previous sermons, we have seen the cross anticipated and arranged. Jesus knew why he was here on earth. The Son of God had become human, fully God, fully human while on this earth. But he had come for the purpose of giving his life for the sins of mankind. During his ministry, he spoke of his upcoming death. And as time drew closer to this last week, he spoke more and more often to the 12 about what lay ahead for him. And so he knew his death was coming. We know the meaning of his death. The Gospel writers describe that for us. Other scriptures do as well. As we saw last Sunday, the cross was arranged. Jesus didn't die accidentally. He wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. The leaders of the Jews turned against him early. He threatened them. And so they were out to get him. They arranged for his death. This morning we will consider the cross preceded. We look at this last week leading up to the cross. We'll be looking primarily in the Gospel of Matthew, beginning with chapter 21, on down through chapter 26. We have Sunday. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. As they get near to Jerusalem, Jesus says to 2 of his disciples, "Go to this certain place, there you will find a donkey and her coat. Take them. If anybody asks you about it, say, 'My Lord or my Master has need of them.' They won't bother you." Matthew tells us that this was to fulfill what was spoken in the prophet. That would be the prophet Zechariah. "Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a coat, the foal of a beast of burden." Someone made the observation that it's interesting that Jesus rides the last 2 miles into Jerusalem on the back of an animal, because he always walked everywhere he went. He had probably walked from Galilee to Jerusalem. But he is going to enter the city as a king would, not on a great big horse, but showing humility on the back of a donkey. The disciples do as Jesus instructed. They find the coat. They're allowed to take the coat. When they come to Jesus, they put their cloaks on the back of the animal. People lay down their coats in the pathway. Others take branches off of trees and lay them there in the pathway. And as Jesus comes into Jerusalem, The people shout, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. When he got to Jerusalem, Matthew says the whole city was stirred up. People said, who is this? And some answered, the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. Jesus goes into the temple area, and he sees there the money changers, the people selling the animals, and he drives them out. He says, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer. You have made it into a den of robbers. We then read that the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. Chief priests and the scribes see the wonderful things that he's doing, and they want him to stop. They see the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David. The religious leaders are indignant. They said, do you hear what they're saying? Jesus said to them, yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise. Jesus left there. He goes out of the city to Bethany. It's about 2 miles away. And he spent the night there. It's quite possible that he was in the home of his good friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Just a short time before, as you recall, he had raised Lazarus from the dead. The next day, Tuesday, next day, Monday, no, my days of the week. Next day, Monday, Jesus returns to Jerusalem. As they're going along, and they see a fig tree. He curses it. A bit puzzling. Some think that it was a sign of what was going to happen to the Jewish nation because of their rejection of him. It was actually on Monday that Jesus cleansed the temple, if I recall. Well, I'm getting my chronology confused a bit here. You need to read along in Matthew. But Jesus was moving along doing these different things. He is showing his authority. He rebukes the leaders of the people. They are not seeking the will of God. They're seeking to do what they want to do. So on Monday, we have various activities, various confrontations with the leaders. Jesus tells parables, the parable of the 2 sons. Which of these 2 sons was actually obedient to his father? The answer, the only answer, is the one who did what the father wanted. The obvious application is that was not what the Jewish leaders were doing. There's the parable of the tenants. The owner of the field rents out his field. He going to collect, sends servants. They're rejected, abused. He sends his own son. He is put to death. Even the Jewish leaders saw themselves being talked about in this parable. On Tuesday, again after Jesus has left and spent the night elsewhere, on Tuesday we have confrontations and warnings. We come now over to Matthew 26, I believe it is. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Jesus had spent time answering questions, being confronted by the Jewish leaders. He says it's now getting very close to Passover time. We see that the betrayal of Jesus is arranged. Jewish leaders are wondering, okay, how can we get Jesus arrested here? They're afraid to do it during the Passover season because this population is swelled. They don't want a riot on their hands. But one of the 12, Judas, we don't know what got into Judas. There have been all kinds of speculations. But he decides to betray Jesus. He's willing to turn Jesus over to the Jewish leaders. So that is arranged. It's also on this day that Jesus is at Bethany. A woman comes, anoints his feet with a very costly perfume. She's criticized, but Jesus praises her. He says, "Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." On Wednesday, there are no recorded activities of Jesus and his disciples. It's a very busy week, but on Wednesday, nothing's recorded. I suppose we can speculate that Jesus rested, spent time in prayer, perhaps talked with the disciples. But then we come to Thursday. It's time for the Passover. And Jesus is going to observe this last Passover with his own disciples. Again, he wants them to make arrangements. And he says, "Go into the city. You'll see a certain man say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' The disciples did as Jesus said. The house is made available. Preparations are made for the Passover. It comes time for the Passover. John's gospel tells us that apparently wasn't anyone there to wash their feet. When you came in off the dusty streets, there was usually a servant there to wash feet. There was no one there. So Jesus took the basin and the towel and began to wash the feet of the 12. And you recall that, impetuous Peter says, "Well, you're not going to wash my feet." Peter realized that he was the disciple, Jesus was the master. And Jesus says, "If I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me." So Peter just says, "Wash all of me then." Jesus says, "No, all you need wash is your feet." Jesus gave a great lesson on humility, a lesson that the 12 needed. The Passover is observed. Jesus reveals that one of the 12 is going to betray him. It is at this feast, at the Passover, that Jesus, for the first time, observes the Lord's Supper. He takes the bread, blesses it, and says, "This is my body." He takes the cup and says, "This is my blood, given us a new covenant, sign of a new covenant." He says, "When you partake of this, do this in remembrance of me." After they finish this, Judas has gone on his way. Jesus and the 11 go to Gethsemane garden, just outside of Jerusalem, up on a hill, valley between the main part of Jerusalem and Gethsemane. Jesus takes 3 of the disciples with him a little further into the garden, and he goes on a little ways and begins to pray. And he prays that he might be able to avoid the suffering that is ahead. He says, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." Jesus will pray for a while. He'll go to the 3. He finds them sleeping. He does this a couple of times. And finally, he returns to them and says, "It's now time to go." There in the garden, and probably they could look down out of the garden down into the valley and see the torches of a procession coming. But Judas and a band of armed men find Jesus in the garden. Judas betrays Jesus by kissing him. Well, Peter, good old Peter, cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Now, you've got a group of armed men here. They're there to arrest Jesus. And this one guy pulls out a sword. He is greatly outnumbered. Cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Well, Jesus rebukes Peter, and he's able to control the situation. He heals the servant's ear. But Jesus is then arrested. Matthew says, Matthew chapter 26, verse 56, "But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled." Jesus is now alone. He's been arrested. Well, it was indeed a very busy week. We've just hit the highlights. Coming to an end is some 3 years of ministry. 3 years of miracles, 3 years of teaching, 3 years of his enemies accusing him and confronting him. And during this last week, he continues to show that he is the one who is doing God's will, that he is the one who is speaking truth. He is guilty of no crime, certainly not a crime deserving execution. On Sunday, Jesus entered Jerusalem to praise. On Thursday, the Jewish leaders succeeded in arresting Jesus. Friday will be the trials and execution. The way of the cross was God's eternal plan. Before God ever created one bit of the universe, before he ever created us, he already knew that we were going to need saving. So he put his plan of salvation into place. And that plan was the way of the cross. That God would become man, that the Son of God would give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus will soon fulfill the plan of God.